Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at the land of Greece in our continuing study of New Testament backgrounds. As we look at a map of Greece, notice we have Macedonia in the north, and then we come to the Greek peninsula itself. I ought to mention that they do not call their country Greece, they never have. They call it Hellas. We got the term Greece in the same way that an American going down to Mexico might be described as a gringo. But our story isn't going to begin in either Macedon or Greece. Instead, it's going to begin to the long island to the south, the island of Crete. The island of Crete was the home of the Minoan civilization, the famous bull leapers doing acrobatics on bulls, and their great land of unwalled cities were the thing of mythology among the Greeks. The art forms are very early. We see these sort of things as early as 2000 BC, and then we're looking at the ruins at Knossos a bit after. Um, they were a people that were highly advanced in technology, but also in art forms, and so they are the ones who brought civilization to this island. And because they were an island people, of course, they had to use boats to get out there. And so, in this land of great palaces, hot and cold running water, they had developed throughout the Mediterranean something of a what's called a thalassocracy. That is a kingdom that's ruled by their power of the sea. The the land of Crete to the north, we have this island of Thera, which back in the second millennia BC, the island itself actually blew up. You can go there today. You can go there today and still see the remains of the volcano. I think of it as inactive, but actually, some days you'll actually see plumes coming from the center over on the right. And this giant island that sank into the sea gave rise to the legends of Atlantis. It's after the fall of the Minoans that we have the kingdom of Mycenae, probably the kingdom that brought down the Minoans. The Mycenaean civilization, known for their big cities, um, the huge stones that make up the walls of these cities, their figure-8 shields. And you can imagine this is actually a close-up of a sword, a carving. Look at the large shields, some of which might need an armor bearer, and you see the same culture that was around in the days of Saul. And remember the stories of Jonathan and his armor bearer doing great things in the book of First Samuel. They had a written language. You have actually two different languages from the Minoans. You had Mycenaeans, I should say, Linear A and then Linear B. One has been deciphered, the other has not. And you can see the size of the stones. Later Greeks would refer to them as uh, uh, s- uh, like stones of a cyclops, cyclopean stones, because they were so very large. Look at the large stone gates, the large stone walls, larger than life. Here's another shot from just from the other side of the same gate, in the countryside of southern Greece, what was known as the Peloponnesus. They've also discovered great tombs. They look sort of like a upside down beehive. And it's from Mycenae and also their arch enemy from the past, Troy, that we have these legends that were written down, passed along by Homer, the poet, of the great Trojan War. Sure enough, Troy has been uncovered. There were actually a number of levels of Troy. It was Troy 7A, that goes back to that historic Trojan War. And if you go there today, they have a little tourist attraction, their own Trojan horse. But that was the stuff of legends of the Greeks, and every Greek knew of those legends. They didn't think of it as legends; they thought of it as their early history. And so we move from Troy in the New Testament. Well, let's pick up the path of the Apostle Paul. Remember, he was at Troas when he had a a dream, a vision of someone from Macedonia, and so he and his companions got into a boat. They sailed across to Neapolis, and nearby would be the city of Philippi, from where we were going to see the first converts. So let's go to Neapolis. Actually, it's called Kabbalah today. And you can still see the Roman ruins. Here's an aqueduct that runs through the center of the city. And we're going to leave this area and go inland about 10 or 12 miles as we come to a river that flows past the ruins of Philippi. It was here at this river that the Apostle Paul made his first convert, Lydia, a seller of purple fabrics, and he baptized her. And this began the church in Philippi. Now, Philippi was a Roman colony. It had been actually, there had been some people here earlier. The city got its name from Philip the One-Eyed, the father of Alexander the Great. And you can go there and see the ruins, but the city itself had been given a special status by Rome, colonial status, and that meant that its citizens were citizens of Rome. From Philippi, we're going to move west to Thessalonica. Now, whereas Philippi has been excavated, Thessalonica never needed an excavation because the city itself, the city of Thessalonica, is still a major city. In fact, it's the second largest city in all of the country of Greece. Back in the early 1900s, there was a fire. Actually, it was started off as an earthquake, and some buildings caught fire as a result of that, and were in ruins. And they were going to level that area of the city and put in, I don't know if it was a supermarket or put in some big new construction. But when they dug down to the foundations, they found remnants of the much older city going back 2,000 years, going back to the days of the Apostle Paul. We're looking at an odeum, sort of like a miniature theater, might be used as a meeting place or to teach classes and so on. I can only imagine maybe the Apostle Paul coming here and speaking to people about Jesus. On a clear day, you can, and you don't have that many clear days in Thessalonica. The smog usually disrupts your vision. But on a clear day, it rained the night before I took this photo, and it cleared off all the smog, and you can see across the water of the bay to Mount Olympus in the distance. From Thessalonica, we're going to move southward to Meteora. On our way to Meteora, we're going to pass by, get a much closer view of Mount Olympus. But then we come to Meteora itself, and it rises up out of the plains, these great giant rock formations. Let's zoom in on one of these, and we're going to zoom in even further. You notice that on the side of that rock here, let's get a little closer where we can see. That's actually a person there. He and his companion are rappelling down the side of that great giant rock face. And as we come here, we see monasteries that have been built atop of these giant rocks. You can go there today, and I was actually examining the old elevator system. I did not take a ride in this. And these monasteries were established so that the monks that lived there were left and continued to protect their their Christian heritage when the Muslims came in and actually had taken over all of Greece. They left the monasteries alone, and much later, after the monks left, after the Muslims left, the monks came back down and sort of re-evangelized and said, "Hey, let us tell you about the Jesus that we've been believing in all along. It's the faith of this country." And they maintained, after all, Greece had become a Christian country, and so it should be. So we're going to leave Matera and go back across the plains that we traveled to get here. Let's leave Matera, and now we're going to move down to Athens. Athens is the capital of Greece today, but it was not back in New Testament times. Instead, the capital was Corinth, and we'll get to Corinth eventually. Stand in Athens, at almost any place in the city, and you're going to see the Acropolis. It's the most familiar landmark. A great building that's dedicated to the goddess Athena. They've been reconstructing it, or at least last time I was there, it was under reconstruction. It was actually blown up. The Turks were using it as a storage facility, and they blew the roof off. They were storing ammunition there, and it somehow caught fire and blew the roof off and damaged it greatly. It must have been something to behold, but if you were there in Paul's day, you could, and even today, you can see Piraeus, the port, some 7 miles or so from the Aegean. In Paul's day, you had the Acropolis, notice up in the left-hand corner, and then the Agora. The word Agora just means the open space. Remember how somebody has agoraphobia? That means they're afraid of open spaces. The Agora was an open space, but it also served as the place where you would buy and sell, sort of like the marketplace. But then on the ridge, just under the Acropolis, you had what was called the Areopagus. Areopagus, Ares, was the god of war. The Romans knew him as Mars, and Apagus is a hill. So the hill of Ares, or I guess you could call it Mars Hill if you are a Roman, and remember that this was the days of the Romans. It was to this Areopagus, and we're looking at it from down below. Let's zoom in on it, and you can see it's just a big stone, sort of not even ruins. It's it's just a big area of stone. But back then, this had originally been the place where the town fathers had met. And in Paul's day, here I'm coming down from the steps that are carved into that. In Paul's day, the Areopagus had instead turned into the place where people would discuss various philosophies. And so it was that Paul came here. I had the opportunity I've been there a few times, but I remember on my first visit, uh, a a crowd gathered, and I began to just teach through Acts chapter 17. I felt like I was in Paul's sort of reliving his experience as I began to share the gospel, and that's exactly what Paul did. He came to the Areopagus under the shadow of the Acropolis above him. And here he began to talk about Jesus and share the gospel. The way he began, he said, I noticed that you have all sorts of beliefs around here, all sorts of idols and altars and things like that. And I saw one idol. It was set up. It was set up to the unknown God. Now, what's interesting is that we know the background of such a altar, an altar to the unknown God. The story is told by the Greek poet Epimenides about 600 years before the coming of the Apostle Paul, how there had been a great famine in Athens, and Epimenides tells how they just assumed they must have offended one of the gods. And so they turned a flock of sheep loose on the Areopagus, the same spot where Paul was now speaking to them, and wherever the one would lie down and not eat, there they would erect an altar and they would kill the sheep and figure eventually we'll get the right spot to the right God and we'll make him so he's not angry at us anymore and we can go about our business. And so these altars remained, and Paul uses that as a bridge. He says, let me tell you about the God that you don't know. He's not saying that it's the God that Epimenides knew, but the God that you realize you don't know. Let me tell you about him. After Athens, let's take a quick run to the other side of what's called the Peloponnesus. That's that peninsula on the southern part of Greece, to the city of Olympia. Now we saw Mount Olympus way up there in the north across the bay from Thessalonica, but this is the city of Olympia. No relation between the two. One is the mountain, one is the city, and it's the city that's the place where you had the Olympic Games begin. And so here we are. We're at Olympia. Um, it's in a sad state of disrepair thanks to an earthquake that knocked down. I found it interesting. You used to seeing the pillars, but here you see the pillar that's been knocked down. It looks like a bunch of giant Oreo cookies that are stacked up against each other in sort of a state of disrepair. It shows you how these pillars were constructed. They weren't one big giant one piece. Rather, they had been assembled sort of like a giant erector set. You can go there. This was a place where the Greeks would come. And remember, Greece in its early history was not a unified country. Instead, it was a place where you had a number of different city states. But once every 4 years, they would lay aside their differences and they would come to participate in the Olympic Games. Here we're looking at the hallway that leads out to the stadium. What's interesting is the arch that you see there. Um, it used to be thought that the Romans are the ones who had invented the arch. After all, they use it quite a bit. But this arch dates much earlier than the Romans. It tells us that the Greeks were the ones who had invented the arch, even though they didn't use it in a lot of different occasions. And so we'll depart from Olympia, and let's now turn our attention to our final stop, and this is going to be Corinth. Now, to get to Corinth, if you're up in northern Greece, you're going to pass over the isthmus, and today there's actually a channel that's been cut out. Here's a small ship. Big ships are it's much too narrow for big ships, but a small cargo vessel can make its way through that. That channel was not there in New Testament times. Actually, it wasn't cut until the late 1800s. Although Julius Caesar had it in mind to try to cut this channel, and Nero actually attempted it with slave labor that had been gotten as they were picking up Jewish slaves in the Jewish rebellion. Of course, Nero died before Jerusalem fell, but they had plenty of slaves to go around, and they actually attempted to cut the channel. They were unsuccessful at that time. Now, Corinth was wonderfully located because any ships that were going from the Aegean over to the Adriatic, you could try to take the long way around, and that was hazardous. You were really taking your life in your hands. It was much easier for a ship to dock at Serenkia, and then it's only about 4 miles across the isthmus to the port on the other side. Lycaon is the port on the other side, and Corinth is the large city that sort of oversees both of those ports. So let's go to Corinth, and the first thing we see here at the Temple of Apollo, and in the background, you see what's called the Acro-Corinth. A high place would always be there well, shouldn't say in all Greek cities, but if there was one, that would be the place. And the Acro-Corinth was the place up there. You had a temple to Aphrodite, the goddess of love, and she looked over the city, and although you had plenty of other temples, like I said, this is the Temple of Apollo in the foreground, um, and yet Aphrodite had given not just love to the city, but the city was known as the city of love, the city of lust, I should probably say. Um, in fact, when you use the expression to act like a Corinthian, it's sort of to Corinthianize, that meant you were behaving badly with regard to sexual conduct. from Corinth, you can see the two waterways, the two nearby ports. And notice as you go out the back door, where you still see in the distance the Temple of Apollo, go out the back door from the temple, and you found yourself in the marketplace of Corinth. You'll remember that Paul addresses the issue of meat that had been offered to idols. Someone would bring in their offering to the temple, and it would be offered to the god Apollo. He didn't take too much, and so when it was done, they would just go out the back door and sell the same meat in the marketplace. And the question that Christians had, were they allowed to eat that meat that had been offered to idols? And Paul explains, don't go seeking the pedigree of the meat. I mean, if somebody makes an issue of it, then don't eat because you don't want to engage in idolatry. But if you just pick up meat in the marketplace, just eat it and don't ask where it's coming from. Don't make it an issue because it's really not one. Now, remember that's the Acrocorinth in the distance, but up close we have what was known as the bema. Some people have thought of it as the bema seat. It wasn't actually a seat, it was a platform. If you go to Greece today and walk into the Parliament building, the place on which the speaker stands, that's known as the bema. It's a raised platform, a place of judgment, a place of decisions. And the Apostle Paul was actually brought before the Bema here in Corinth. Remember that Corinth was the seat of the proconsul, that is, the Roman governor of all of Greece, would have his seat here at the Bema and here in Corinth. And Christianity was placed on trial, and the Roman proconsul at the time, his name was Gallio, he actually threw the case out of court, refused to hear it, and and let the Christians go, which meant that Christianity had been placed on trial and it had been found legal. Another thing that we haven't we know there was a synagogue here in Corinth. We found this column with three menorahs engraved on it, but we haven't found the actual synagogue of Corinth. I found interesting these various statues that had no heads, and so I asked. I said, "What's with the statues with no heads? Did somebody come and knock them off and didn't like these people?" And my guide explained to me. He said, "No, that's not the case. Actually, they were made that way, and then you would make the head, and you say, 'Well, I want a statue of Julius Caesar.' That's whose face we're looking at. Well, you would just take the head of Julius Caesar and place it on the statue, and so you had these statues that were pre-made, just waiting for the head. Whether the only question to ask, how is Caesar going to be dressed? Is he going to be dressed in a military outfit, or is he going to be dressed like a philosopher? Uh, and so you have the statuary that was ready to accommodate the need of the day. As I was walking out, and this was actually, I took this picture the very first time I was at Corinth. I've been there a couple of times. And we were walking past the outdoor section of the museum, and all of a sudden I turned and happened to glance down and see this statue. Actually, it was broken from the knees up, so this was almost all that was there. And what caught my eye were the sandals. And it reminded me of the words of the Apostle Paul, where he's actually quoting from Isaiah. And he says, "How beautiful are the feet of those who bring glad tidings of good things." And it reminded me because in my travels throughout Greece and throughout that part of the world, I've used all sorts of transportation techniques, whether buses or cars or sometimes by boat. Um, and yet Paul had come this way for the most part walking. And so it was, I just leave that with a closing thought that these were feet that walked over a great portion of the empire in order to spread and bring us the gospel, the good news of Jesus and how he lived and died and rose again for us.